everyone. My name is Kimberly O'Neill, and I want to officially welcome you to the Before the Ask Nonprofit Startup Fundraising Summit. I am the CEO of Giving Blueprint, and my work is rooted in walking alongside nonprofit startups, grassroots leaders, and culturally led organizations because so often they are the ones standing in the gap and making sure communities don't get left behind. The Before the Ask Nonprofit Startup Fundraising Summit was created to give you practical tools and encouragement around one of the hardest parts of this work, fundraising. We designed this space so you can build confidence and capacity before you even make the ask. This session is being provided at no cost thanks to a generous grant to the philanthropic arm of Giving Blueprint, the Community Capacity Fund, under our Nonprofit Advancement Initiative. The Community Capacity Fund is a fiscally sponsored project of Players Philanthropy Fund. The Nonprofit Advancement Initiative was designed specifically for nonprofit startup leaders, new nonprofit leaders, grassroots and culturally led organizations, and those serving under-resourced communities. If that sounds like you are in the right place. Now, I am honored to introduce today's speaker. Valerie Gotcher is a dedicated nonprofit leader, consultant, and change maker with more than 13 years of experience guiding organizations towards growth and sustainability. As the founder of a 501c3 launched from her dining room table, she successfully built the organization into a $1 million nonprofit, securing major grants, government funding, fee for service contracts, and stewarding individual donors. Valerie also served as board president for a national membership organization, leading with vision, strategy, and mission centered collaboration. Through Gotcher Consulting Group LLC, she helps nonprofits move their agendas forward by scaling wisely and building the infrastructure needed for long term success. Her grant writing success rate consistently exceeds national averages, reflecting both expertise and a talent for connecting people and resources to meaningful missions. Valerie holds a nonprofit management certificate from CNM Dallas and a master's degree in speech language pathology from the University of North Texas. Without further delay, I'll turn the session over to Valerie, who will guide us for today's session. Governing with Grit, turning board duties into dollars. Welcome, Valerie. Take it away.
Welcome, especially to everyone joining us from Texas. We endured some really wild weather yesterday evening. So if you're here, that means you have power and internet today and hopefully not a great deal of damage from the storms. And welcome to everyone else. It's very exciting that we have international guests here today too. So let me get my screen going here for us. Hold on just one second. Here we go. So everyone should be able to see this, let's hope. So as Kimberly mentioned, I'm going to cover some very common pain points that I hear and have experienced firsthand between leadership, especially founders of grassroots and growing, scaling small to mid-sized nonprofits, and their board, their central leadership. And really, what a lot of this centers on, and kind of the onus for putting this information together for boards, is that you don't know what you don't know. And there's nothing wrong with that because, from my perspective, I feel very strongly that board members should first come to the table to their nonprofit organizations with passion. And that is something that you cannot teach. But everything else that we'll talk about today are things that you can learn. There are skills, there are resources out there, and hopefully this session will help you check off a lot of those boxes. So here we go, governing with grit, turning your board duties into dollars. I'll restate our introduction just a little bit. Great boards don't just meet, they move missions forward. So this session will give board members practical, no-fluff strategies to fulfill their fiduciary duties while becoming powerful partners in fund development. I want you today to learn how to assess your board's current role, elevate their engagement, and turn governance into fundraising momentum. So, our guiding question is, how can our governance work also fuel fundraising? And I'm going to give you what's hopefully not a negative spoiler alert, but here's the alert. This work is not solely about making the ask. This is about building your infrastructure and growing from there. And your ask is going to come at the end. All right. So we're going to divide this session today into these sections, starting with the mission, the vision, and purpose. Like I said, we're starting with the base, your foundation. We're going to talk about what type of board you currently are, and hopefully that'll help you think about what kind of board do we want to be in the future. We will talk about fiduciary duties and practice for board members, some essential early policies that I could argue that every single board needs, turning duties into dollars, and then we'll have a wrap up and reflection. And I believe we should have some time for Q&A as well, which is usually my favorite part. I will tell you a couple of things. I'm coming to you with this information from the lens of what a lot of 501c3 organizations will follow, but I also have a lot of experience with 501c6 organizations, which is a membership organization or maybe a chamber of commerce. So just wanted to throw that disclaimer out that that's the lens with which I'm bringing a lot of this information to you. So let's start with your clarity of mission. So clarity of mission is going to equal clarity in fundraising. Every board member should be able to clearly state the mission of your organization. And boards rate themselves in general with an A minus in regards to knowing and understanding and then being able to communicate their mission statement. Um, I will throw this out there too, just so you know. I have a lot of information in here about how boards rate themselves, and this information comes from boardsource.org. It's a great resource for board of directors and leadership. So I'm going to intersperse those ratings. So that comes from a robust survey from Board Source when I talk about how boards are rating themselves. All right. So I brought together some really strong mission statements for you to have a look at today. The top three on this slide are actual true and real life mission statements. And the bottom three are some fictitious ones that I made up for the purpose of this presentation. On the top, a couple are probably going to sound familiar to you. The first is charity water. We bring clean and safe drinking water to people in developing countries. Simple, to the point, easy to remember. The next one is the Nature Conservancy. We conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And then the third in the top row is Habitat for Humanity International. Seeking to put God's love into action, we bring people together to build homes, communities, and hope. And then our fictitious examples, we fight hunger and restore dignity by ending food insecurity in every community we reach. We protect endangered species and revive ecosystems so nature and people can thrive together. We prepare students to think, create, and lead through transformative learning. And we'll circle back to why these are really good mission statements in just a second. So let's look at some vision statements that would be matched to each one of those mission statements. So the Charity Water mission statement is to bring clean and safe water to every person on the planet. So although this is written in present tense, it is focusing on the future, and that vision statement absolutely evokes excitement about an ambitious future outcome. And then just skip over there to the Habitat Humanity International vision statement. They imagine a world where everyone has a decent place to live. I can't imagine a more simple, evocative way to state this is our vision. And so keep in mind that I know these are big organizations, but even in smaller community organizations, there's something driving you to do the work you're doing. There's something behind the reason why you formed this organization. And it doesn't have to just be limited by what's within your own community. Really think big when you write your vision statement. So this one, which is fictitious on the bottom, a future without food insecurity where no one goes hungry. So again, it's not limited or bounded by one specific community. All right, so let's talk about for a second strong mission statements and why those on the slide previous are really good ones. They don't use the words support, make, or provide. I'm not saying those are bad words and not to use them in the nonprofit that I founded and ran for over a decade. I think used all three of those words, at least two out of the three. So they're not necessarily bad words in a mission statement, but they are used a lot. So try to think about some really strong verbs and some action words that may come outside of support, make, and provide. All of those mission statements were written in the present tense. They all clearly state the why and the problem that's being solved, and they're all really short. I don't even know that one single mission statement I showed you there was over 20 words, but most of them were about 12 to 15 words in length. And then I have a couple of tips for you about your mission statement. One would be don't be afraid to have a look at your mission statement and make a revision. It's okay to do that. Your formation documents and even your bylaws will not have to be redone and reimagined just because you change your mission statement, as long as your purpose stays the same. So please keep that in mind. And then my other tip about your mission statement is to incorporate what a lot of people call as a mission moment into every one of your board meetings. Now, a lot of what I'm going to share with you for the rest of this session are going to be things that will keep your board busy in governance work in your board meetings. So what I'm suggesting is in the midst of doing all your governance work in your board meetings on record, make sure you're incorporating a mission moment into each one. So that continues to fuel the passion and remind everybody this is why we're here and doing what we're doing. So, success stories, for example. All right, let's move on. What type of board are you? Again, you don't know what you don't know when you join a board, especially when your board of directors is composed of maybe friends or work colleagues or sometimes relatives who have a lot of trust in the leadership and trust each other and work well together. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with your beginning board and your formative board being composed of those people. But as the life cycle of a nonprofit progresses, as what we're all hoping for you all on this call today and watching the recording, is that with growth, maybe some of those roles and some of the composition and the diversity of your board does need to change. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And again, I'll remind you, passion is first and foremost for your board of directors. So back to that rating. Boards tend to rate themselves with a C for composition, so obviously there's room for improvement. And composition here refers to the makeup or the structure of the board, who the members are, what are the skills, the backgrounds, and perspectives that they bring to the organization. And this again may be synonymous with board diversity. So a new nonprofit is almost always going to function as a working board or an all volunteer board. And then our last one here is there's no single right type of board of directors for every nonprofit. And in my experience, what I tend to see is most successful, especially in transitional periods, is a healthy mix of a few different types of boards. So let's look at maybe what that looks like on a continuum. So continuum showing the range and some gradual differences between two extremes. So in this case, on one end of the continuum, we have the day-to-day operations, what's also called a management team or a working board. on one end, and then a long-term visionary board, which might be referred to as a policy or governing board on the other end of the spectrum. So again, I'm going to say it. There's no right or wrong, but I'm going to try to explain to you a little bit about what all these types really mean in practice. So our management team or our working board is usually performing all the duties that the nonprofit requires, sometimes through committees, and that includes HR, fundraising, finance, planning, programs, events, all that, all the work, all the hustle bustle, boots on the ground. That is referred to as a management team or working board. So they are engaged in all types of things involved in the nonprofit's work. And again, this is how most nonprofits start their journey. A cooperative board, or maybe a co-op, if you've heard of those before, there's an even distribution of power, and these are going to operate without an executive director or CEO, one person in leadership. So, some examples of a co op or cooperative board would be maybe a membership organization, an advocacy group, or a faith based group, um, or sometimes maybe a community land trust. They often burn out. So, that's the problem with a cooperative board, and some of the reasons for that is because of diffuse and shared responsibility. They may lack the resources for staff and extra support. And sometimes a cooperative board is going to be slow with decision making because, again, there's equal distribution of power amongst all of the members. All right, so patron and advisory or advisory boards, those are two different things. So, an advisory board is a board that serves as a resource for the leadership to turn to for help and advice. An advisory board is going to offer their professional skills and talents at no cost to the organization. And a lot of times, an advisor to on a board of directors helps lend credibility to the organization just by sharing and using their name. Many times, advisory board members don't have a specific term or term limits. They are separate from the governing board. And as an organization grows, I think an advisory board tends to be a really great place for some of those founding board members to transition to kind of help keep leadership grounded. I also think an advisory board tends to be a great place for, like I said, people with specific skills and knowledge that maybe you don't need to tap into that on a regular, consistent basis. But maybe you need to talk to a commercial real estate person, professional once a year, or maybe you're looking at renovating a building in the future and you need to talk to an architect. Those are great people to have on an advisory board. One of the things that I did as an ED, as my board members transitioned off and their terms expired, they would tend to roll on to my advisory board so that, again, we would keep that connection and really maintain the relationship. So that's lots of many different ways actually you can think of as an advisory board. All right, a patron board is a little bit different. Patron board, the members have personal wealth or they have influence to purpose, and their purpose is to contribute funds and use their network to gain outside contributions for the organization. The great thing about a patron board is that they can move money, but they need to be realigned to the mission. And patron boards are seen pretty frequently in maybe large hospital networks or higher education, and they usually work in alignment with a separate board or committee and separate governing board. Okay, and now we've moved on to the other end of our continuum with the what I would call the long-term visionaries, the policy or the governing boards. So this is really the staple platform for nonprofits where there is a high level of trust given to the CEO or the executive director. This type of board creates space for growth, mitigates risk while also delegating operations. So all that day-to-day stuff at the other end of the continuum on this slide, they're going to delegate and give that to the CEO and ED. so that the board then kind of hovers out of that level of responsibility, or what we may say, getting out of the weeds so they can see the forest. So your long-term visionary board. And I'll again restate this, there's no right type of board. And what I see successful is some combination of the two ends of this spectrum. And what matters most is that each member brings genuine passion for the mission, because enthusiasm cannot be taught. Skills can be learned and resources can be found, but authentic commitment is irreplaceable. All right, let's move on to our next. I'm going to take a sip of water. Here we go. Fiduciary duties in practice. So let's start with a definition of what does that mean? A fiduciary is a person who has the legal and ethical responsibility to act in the best interest of the organization and its mission. Board Source survey indicates that boards rate themselves with a B+ regarding financial oversight. So that's a pretty good self-rating, I would say. These fiduciary duties in practice are going to cover the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. So let's figure out what that exactly means. So we've got them in order here: care, loyalty, and obedience. So the duty of care really just means that as a board member, you're going to pay attention and take initiative. You're going to take care of the nonprofit by ensuring a prudent use of all of its resources. You're going to review the financials, and you're also going to view, approve, and take ownership of the annual budget, and make sure that those financial and fundraising goals are realistic. That's the duty of care. The duty of loyalty means that you are making decisions in the best interest of the nonprofit over your personal or professional interest. This has everything to do with recognizing and disclosing conflicts of interest and following a conflict of interest policy that your board needs to collectively agree upon. That's the duty of loyalty. Duty of obedience really means you're doing the right thing. You're going to follow laws, you're going to monitor compliance, and avoid mission drift in fundraising. And if you're not familiar with what that term means, in thinking about your mission statement prior, it means you're sticking to that. It means that you're not going to alter the purpose or the programs or the work of your organization to fit into the mold that a particular fundraiser or donor is suggesting to you. You're going to stick with your mission and not let that drift for the sake of fundraising. All right, this is where things might get a little interesting for anyone who doesn't already have a budget on paper. So this goes back to the duty of care, having that financial oversight and taking ownership of the annual budget. Now, I generally recommend that the leadership, the founder typically, and what's a grassroots or early in their development nonprofit, is going to take what their goals and objectives and all those things that you're usually doing and work in collaboration with the board to develop a budget that speaks to what funders understand. So taking that from an accounting perspective and then what funders understand may look a little bit different. So I just recommend simplifying as much as possible and dividing your revenue streams into something that looks a little bit like this. This is a real life budget for an organization that, for these first two lines, individual giving and corporate giving, those were their only two revenue streams in their first year and second year of operation. And this is showing a transition pretty much between year 3 and 4. So they're doing really well with individual giving and even some corporate giving. And what you see here indicated by the star are some revenue streams that were added in years 3 and 4. grant, one particular grant they became eligible for and were invited to apply for, and then subsequently won for $20,000 was added in year three. And then to piggyback off of that, adding into year three, here in North Texas, we've got a gigantic day of giving. I believe that early giving has actually already started now. A special event called North Texas Giving Day. So this will be the first year this organization is participating in raising additional funds through that event. And then they're planning another one that was to be determined. So this is their expected revenue for this year. And let's look at their expenses. Now, again, I would recommend you put revenue and expenses all on one page and keep it simple. But just for the purpose and the sake of this presentation, these two things wound up on two different slides. So again, we've got a couple of stars here that are indicating some future plans, some personnel that they were going to add, and that's plugged into operating because the personnel they want to add is going to strictly be an admin type of role, a support services person that's not going to be involved in the programming of the organization. And then there's another star indicating a new expense for professional contracted service. And again, that's a growth, future planning as well for fund development and marketing. And then everything that touches the people that this organization serves is in programs. Now, this will look different. All those little subcategories under programs, this will look different for every organization as far as supplies and merchandise, storage, personnel. So that's your staff, your program director, your executive director, meals, travel. You'll see a couple of these things like meals and travel on here twice, and that's okay because some of that is exclusively related to fund development marketing, and then some of it, of course, is rolled into programs. Okay, I'm going to go backwards for 1 second because I forgot to add this. So one of the things you don't see here are some other sources of revenue that tend to be pretty common. Fee for service, membership dues. I mentioned I'm very familiar with the 501c6 here and there. So membership dues is obviously a source of revenue for those types of organizations. Merchandise sales, rental income, if you sublease out some of your program space to other people or organizations, and then in kind. In kind is definitely not shown on here as revenue, and then you would also want to balance that out somewhere in your expenses for in kind. All right, we got to move on because we have more important things to talk about too. Well, it's all important, right? Okay. Early essential policies. Please bear in mind, this is not an exhaustive list of policies, but I'm going to stress that your bylaws and then these three additional policies are crucial for setting up the stage for sound infrastructure and to mitigate risk, but really more than anything, to establish your credibility and to reinforce the trust that your donors have with you. You've got to have this stuff in place. Policies are not just paperwork. They are the foundation, like I said, for your credibility with funders and for trust. And boards rate themselves with a B plus in regard to legal and ethical oversight. And of course, a B rating is not terrible, but if I think about that from the perspective of a donor, I want the organization that I'm giving my hard-earned dollars to have really strong legal and ethical backbones and policies. So here's what we need to know about your bylaws. Now, if you're coming to this summit today, you've probably already got bylaws in place. They can be changed, but you want to think about your bylaws as being evergreen, something that should not change a whole lot over time. They need to be aligned with your state requirements. Here in Texas, there might be different requirements from our Secretary of State than what some of our neighboring cities, towns, states, national organizations, governing bodies are going to require. Now, they can include a COI, so that's your conflict of interest policy. I see a lot of bylaws written that do include a conflict of interest policy. but sometimes they're very limited when they're rolled into bylaws because it really just explains what conflict of interest means and that board members have to disclose. But many times, what I see is that they don't take the next step and say, well, here's what we're going to do when someone discloses a conflict of interest. There's no roadmap for, well, now what do we do? They disclosed it. Uh, so that's where your policies and procedures come into play. So your bylaws obviously are going to clearly describe your board of director term lengths, the limitations, the processes, and a dissolution plan. So a dissolution plan really simply means what happens if we close our doors? What happens if what if we merge someday later and we change our name or all these things? So there's going to be there should be some things in your bylaws about a dissolution plan and where will the assets go if that happens. So here's a tip. A young nonprofit organization that has strong policies is more competitive in the context of grants than an older organization without that strong base of policies. So think about that because there's always that question of we're not old enough to be eligible for X, Y, and Z, especially grants. But maybe you are if you've got strong policies in place. Okay, so after your bylaws, you want to develop and adopt policies. Again, I stress this and procedures. It's not just the policy that outlines the defining issue that you may face down the road, but what is the procedure and the roadmap? Well, how do we handle that next if we come across a conflict of interest? So, again, that protects your donor confidence. A confidentiality policy is obviously going to ensure that sensitive donor and client information is respected. And then your financial practices policies will reinforce that you are transparent in handling funds, which again builds donor trust. A financial policy should answer a lot of very basic questions. Some of those are who has access to what as far as your finances go and your resources. What are your processes, the limitations, security risk? How do you handle that? How do you keep records? How are they stored, protected, backed up? Do you accept cash? Will you hold raffles? Those are really simple questions. And I have a tip about a few of those things for financial policies. You really need to know the IRS stipulations on fundraising activities that are specific to your nonprofit classification. So, raffles and merchandise sales are two prominent things that you'll have to follow IRS guidelines when you're developing those financial policies. There will be some limitations on those things in particular. All right, let me say one more thing before we go to the next slide, which is getting started into turning duties into dollars. And that is, I highly recommend that you incorporate a donor bill of rights. Oh, here we go. I do have a slide for that. I incorporate the donor bill of rights into your policies somewhere, or at least in practice. But this is a document that's already written, it's out there. It dates back to 1993 and it outlines 10 core rights like knowing how funds are used, receiving honest communication, having privacy respected. And the goal is really simple. When donors feel confident and valued, they stay engaged and they give more generously. So the Donor Bill of Rights is easy to find. It's easy to incorporate into your practices. And I recommend everybody be familiar with what those are. All right, turning duties into dollars. Let y'all marinate on that first bullet point for a second. I can't wait to get to the chat because I keep seeing this indication of all these things happening and hopefully it's all good. But I'm sure a lot of people can relate to number one, my board doesn't want to fundraise. Another thing I hear a lot of, my board doesn't know how to fundraise. And we can deal with either one of these things. But what you really need to know is that fund development is not always about asking for money directly. There are so many ways that board members can play a meaningful role in fundraising without cold calls, without awkward asks. Boards give themselves a C in regards to fundraising, and then also in regards to community relations. I would argue pretty strongly if we can get boards to feel more confident and do more work in the community relations piece, then the fundraising piece is going to follow right along with it. Because again, it's about networking and relationships, not transactions, but relationships. So, boards, let's get better about community relationships, and your fundraising dollars will follow. Let's dig into a little bit more of that. Okay. All right. This is how we turn duties into dollars, everybody. A clear mission statement is going to give you stronger asks. We've covered that. Go back and look at your mission statement. An engaged board of directors is going to equal expanded donor networks and increased donor retention. And then financial oversight. So, that governing work that the board is doing and that duty of care responsibility, plus the age of your organization together is going to equal eligibility for larger gifts. So let's talk about that some more. Here's some data for you. Nonprofits that are under 5 years old without a fiscal sponsor or strong existing partnerships, they should expect about 15 to 25% of all grant opportunities to be realistically available. It's not a whole lot. Many grant funders ask for 3 to 5 years of financials, but what matters more is whether the board demonstrates sound governance. So, all of those previous slides we've already been through: care, loyalty, obedience, bylaws, strong policies that create your foundation. That's your sound governance. That's what we're talking about here. So, in summary, while the age of your nonprofit as you get older is going to open some doors, your financial accountability is going to unlock the bigger ones. Okay, now let's get a little bit more specific. Fundraising action steps for board members. I highly recommend 100% annual board giving, setting that as the expectation and putting it in writing. I see this asked a lot of times on grant applications, and really the funders are looking for buy-in. If the leadership of your organization isn't making an investment in the cause, then why should they? Here's a couple of different ways to do that. You can set a minimum giving dollar amount that's annual, or you define a meaning. And I recommend defining a meaning, because that makes your board giving more equitable. It takes into consideration any person on your board that has a lived experience, or whether it's past or it could be current. Financially, not everyone can give the same dollar amount. So defining a meaning behind your annual board giving, I highly recommend doing. I will tell you that in my nonprofit, the way that we framed that was the expectation was every board member gave a cash gift that was significant enough for them to discuss with their partner, their spouse, or sometimes even their financial advisor. But it was an amount that was going to be meaningful to them. For some people, that might have been a $50 gift for the entire year. And then for some of our board members, that may have been a $10,000 gift. But either way, it still equaled 100% annual board giving. Very important. You can use your board giving as matching or leverage to show leadership buy-in and credibility. But then here's what's really, really important and kind of talks back to that boards giving themselves a C rating for community relationships. Use your board connections as a fundraising bridge. Your board members should be making introductions to the executive director, to program members, giving tours, talking about success stories, and a lot of these things can be done really well in pairs. So again, you don't feel like you're having to just put yourself out there and be awkward about it, but really you're just kind of bringing people into the umbrella of your organization and what you do. And as far as prospect research goes, start with your company, start with your inner circle of connections, and then expand out ultimately to some of these maybe foundations in particular that are invitation only. So, the way that you're going to get in there is through relationship building and figuring out who knows who. LinkedIn is a great tool for that. Okay, let's see what we have next. So again, reincorporating, bringing people together, serving as a fundraising bridge. People give to people. Keep all those things in mind. Um, Board members should be connecting the organization's work to business and civic life. Board members can co-host gatherings. Board members should be buying a great big table at your organization's events and filling it full of colleagues and friends, again, to bring them into the fold of the work that you're doing. Board members should be making introductions to connections associated with fundraising sources and be an ambassador for the mission everywhere you go. So put on your mission hat. Engage your organization and your other fellow board members, your executive director in with service clubs, things like Rotaries, Giving Circles, Junior Leagues. Those are also great sources for additional support from an in-kind perspective, like training. Educational opportunities tend to be really prominent with these type of service organizations. They're great things to plug into. All right. Your board members should also be routinely reviewing your development strategy. So what is your fundraising plan for the year? Board members can also review and edit your donor appeal letters, your newsletters, your grant narratives, all the things. And then board members can and should be leading volunteers and committees, organizing teams for special events, campaigns like North Texas Giving Day that I mentioned. And then I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about retention and saying thank you. Retention is the ability to keep donors giving over time. And this is quite honestly one of my favorite ways to get board members engaged with your fund development work and your fundraising. And here's why. Nonprofits that don't have a formal gratitude process are going to see about 18 to 25% annual donor retention. And we compare that to a nonprofit that has a personal and meaningful process for thanking donors. They will see annual donor retention double or triple to 40 to 70% of retention. So that means your churn of having to find new donors year over year to replace the ones that fall off. Look at how much more you retain by thanking them personally and meaningfully. I cannot stress to you how important this is because think of think of all that churn and all that time and work and energy you are saving yourself. And what you're doing is reinforcing building relationships, but consistently showing gratitude to the people that support your mission. And you can absolutely engage your board member in doing that. There is no substitute for a handwritten card, note, or letter from a board member or even a quick phone call to say, thank you for your gift. I serve as a board member on XYZ organization and I'm really pleased to see that you're supporting this work. Thanks. And that's it. That's all it takes. And look at the return you get for that work. It's my favorite thing. Okay, we're getting close to time. So let's do some wrapping up and reflecting. Strong governance is about influence and it's about responsibility. I want you to think and take away from this at least one action you'll take to strengthen your board's governance. And of course, my tip is going to be you've got to start by reflecting upon your infrastructure, all of those building blocks before you move on to the fundraising action steps. So, if you're missing bylaws or any of those three essential policies and the procedure, the what do we do if roadmap, you've got to get those in place. You've got to approve them. And if they're sitting in draft form, that's not good enough. You need board approval by vote. Okay. Do you know what board type you are and what type of board you want to be? And how can you start working on some transitions as you grow and to support your growth? Does your mission statement need work? It's okay if it does. Clarity is kindness, and clarity equals more dollars. Have you developed and approved, again, there's that word approved, an annual operating budget? You've got to do that. You've got to have that roadmap so that you know where you are right now and where you want to grow into the next 12 months. If you're good with all of that, then work on those fundraising action steps. So I have a couple of minutes to spare. So I have 2 extra slides that I threw in just in case. If you are completely new to raising funds, these are some truths that I want you to recognize. 1, you won't get anything if you don't ask. 2, you need to know your goal and the purpose for the ask. That again ties back into your strong mission and vision statements. When a funder, donor, foundation, corporate entity, whatever it may be, when they say no to you when you're fundraising, that really often means not right now. Always ask for feedback. Always try to get in the right time. And you're not going to know that unless you ask those questions. Everyone has the capacity to give. And when I say that here is this fundraising truth, I don't necessarily mean cash money. I mean volunteer time. I mean a connection to someone else who would be interested in hearing your story. I mean an in-kind donation of office supplies or t-shirts, whatever it may be, but everyone, I believe, has the capacity to give something. And definitely think about that as far as connections go. And there's a good one here at the end. Relationships are more important than transactions. Form those relationships, steward your donors well, thank them generously and often and frequently and personally, and that is going to help you build relationships. And here's a couple of resources for you all. I'm an avid reader, so 3 of the 4 of these are books, and I've thrown in the board source, which is boardsource.org. So that's what I referenced several times this morning as far as board surveys, information. There's a lot of training resources on boardsource.org, specifically for nonprofit board of directors. And then a few of my other favorite books, especially for newer, growing, scaling nonprofits, start with Why by Simon Sinek. Fundraising for Social Change. I believe there's a few editions of that one now by Kim Klein, and that's a great starting point for people new to fundraising. And then the Little Book of Boards is a board member's handbook for small nonprofits. That's a really good one. It's short and a quick read. So I'm going to stop my screen share there and then see what our hosts and our guides and what questions there may be. I'd like to thank you all for listening and for being a part. There's a lot of comments in the chat. I don't know if I can get to all of that.
This
Okay.
is Kimberly. I do have a
Yes.
question that was in the chat.
Awesome.
And it's just expanding on a little bit more about what you talked about. And it's there was a question, is there a cap? And I answered in the chat, but I want to also give you an opportunity. Is there a cap that your board members should have in terms of giving?
I don't think there should be a ceiling. I would just reiterate that idea of setting a minimum dollar amount versus setting a meaning. And I really tend to lean towards setting a meaning. So, what a meaningful gift is to one donor, board member, may not be the same meaningful gift to another board member. So, you really have to take into account the lived experience of each person on your board of directors. Because, let's be honest, talking about your personal finances is really personal and can be uncomfortable. And you don't want to put board members in a position where they're feeling pressured because of what other board members are able to offer and are maybe kind of blatantly putting out there. That can be really uncomfortable. So, like I said, I tend to go towards setting a meaning to a board member's gift that's personal and significant to them. So, a dollar amount that is significant to them that shows that this mission, vision, the purpose of what we're doing is significant to me, but I just don't think that means every board member should give the same exact dollar amount. I hope that makes sense. Thank you for the comment that a meaningful gift, having a conversation before giving. Great. Thank you for the feedback. Are there any thoughts or feedback that you all have? You can put this in the chat about the type of board. This is something that I encounter a whole lot. And there tends to be a lot of challenges out there when boards realize that they need to make the transition between a working board, all volunteer board, over to hiring staff and delegating those day-to-day operations to staff. Do y'all have any thoughts about that piece?
I know we don't have shy people on this call today. What are some of your thoughts? Tap in. We have Valerie here. This is the information, and this is the kind of information that really halts organizations. We look at the fundraising strategies, the grants, the fundraisers, and all of the things, but where we really need to see significant improvement is understanding the compliance and understanding the rules and the regulations about what a board is supposed to do, versus what we allow boards to do. And that's when Valerie is done, I'm going to speak to some of the takeaways that I took from her session. But even when, and I see somebody popped up, so I'm going to jump off, but even when this is an uncomfortable conversation, even when you're digesting that you think that you're the only nonprofit going through challenges with your board, no, you are not alone. And so while we have the time, make sure you're tapping in to ask the questions. I always say be in the front of the room. So this is virtual. Be in the front of the room and ask what you need to be able to make sure that your organization thrives.
That's a good response, actually, to this comment from Shannon. She said, "We are building an advisory board, but I'm wondering if we need a governing board due to being a newer org, less than 3 years old." So I'm going to go back to something that I mentioned, that there's no one right type of board for every organization. And where I see a lot of success, especially in newer nonprofits, is really having a nice blend of a few different things. So yes, you do need a governing board, and some of that, like Kimberly used the word compliance, is about compliance. It depends on what your state is going to delegate you are responsible for forming and committing to. here in Texas, it means you've got to have a certain number of board members, and you have to have a certain number of board members with officer roles. Here, I believe, if I'm remembering right, it's president, treasurer, and secretary. So the VP role is not a requirement here, although lots of boards have that role as an officer. So you've got to have a governing board many times because of compliance. And like I said, what I feel is missed many times in those younger organizations is the governance piece, because everyone is so busy doing the work and doing the day to day and the operations, and they're handling that and they're doing fantastic with it. But you've got to have some of those things in place to be able to build upon your fundraising, your fund development plan in the future, because your policies and procedures are going to give you credibility. They're going to mitigate risk for you as an organization and mitigate risk for each one of you as an individual. And I can't tell you how significant they are. I encounter organizations, some that are 10 and 20 years old, that because they've gotten so caught up in overtime, the day-to-day operations, they're in the trees of the forest, that they totally miss revising their policies if they do exist. Some policies don't exist at all. Employee handbooks are sitting in draft mode on somebody's computer that have never been approved. And that is just wild to me, that you haven't gotten these things out of the way. And it's worth saying too that a governing board, a strong board, is going to regularly review these policies and kind of give yourself a grade, just like in the presentation. How do boards rate themselves on this, this, and this? Well, how closely are we adhering to our own policies for conflict of interest, for financial practices, human resources and personnel, confidentiality, records retention, all the things? You've got to consistently revisit those things and make sure you're following the rules that you agree to. All right, let me check on the chat here. You mentioned 15 to 25% of grants are realistically available to newer organizations. How do you overcome this? Is it just keep going until you get that yes? Oh, that's such a good question. And there's no one single answer to satisfy everything you're asking here. Every situation and every grant funder is different. That's the tricky thing about grant funding. So the data that I pulled to tell you that specifically said for newer organizations that are under that like 3 years of age, that don't have a fiscal sponsor or that don't have a strong existing relationship, that's what they should expect their success rate to be for grants, 15 to 25%. How do you overcome this? Some of it is really just comes down to timeline. Some funders are very hard and fast about a definite age cutoff. And they say, if you are not 5 years old, or you haven't been operating your programs, or you haven't been doing this work in an on-site legit location for this number of years, we will not even talk to you. So some of them just have a hard and fast rule. And you can't overcome that other than just to let time pass, right? Keep doing what you're doing and make sure that you are documenting and tracking your outcomes and your outputs. Are you moving the needle? Because they all want to see that you're moving the needle. Another way to overcome this, obviously, I mean, I hate to say it over and over again, is relationships, building relationships. Who do you need to be talking to? If you're not eligible for funding, for grant funding with one funder, they most likely know someone else that is funding newer startup and grassroots organizations, and ask for that name, ask for that connection. Again, that's work that your board could be doing it too. And some of it, yes, you keep going until you get that yes. But it's just so many different things when you're talking about grant strategy. I work with a lot of organizations that want to add that as part of their revenue stream, and they want to do it really quickly. Um, I will tell you that the national average for grant success rate when you don't have a strong relationship is, I believe it's like somewhere between 5 and 15% ish. If you don't have a strong relationship, if you've got some bit of a relationship and familiarity with a grant funder, that of course is going to raise that statistic. But nationally, most organizations aim for 25% success rate when they're looking at their grant strategy in their portfolio. Um, so that means you're only getting one out of every four that you submit. And that seems really defeating sometimes, but that is kind of the reality of the grant making landscape. So diversity in your revenue streams, like some of those other things I kind of went back and mentioned, but having that foundation too of your individual donors is really your starting point. And then you layer in all the other things like corporate support, in-kind giving, fee for service, membership dues. So, typically it's just not healthy to put all of your eggs in a grants basket because, again, most organizations aim for about 25% success.
We have a few more questions if you want to, and I'll read them to you if that makes it a little bit easier. The first question is how can we invite community members to join our board as we evolve?
Mm. Oh, that's a good question. I think a lot of that answer really lies in who are you connecting with on a regular basis? How are you networking and how are you using those resources? I'm really involved in my local chamber of commerce, and I was very involved in my chamber when I was serving as an executive director of my nonprofit. And I can't tell you how much I learned and gained through that experience because networking is really the way a chamber member sees success. Oh, sorry about that. I had a timer on. Um, so use your networks. I have seen some success and just kind of like mm, maybe not a cold, but like a broad, just a public ask. I did that a couple of times when we were looking for new board members, or at least looking for new board members if in the future. You don't want to just kind of meet somebody and instantly stick them on your board of directors. You really want to get to know them. But we did that a couple of times and we did see success with that. Your departing board members, they should take a role in helping to recruit and bring new people into the fold of the organization. I mentioned that many, many times. But in your board member recruitment, they should be playing a role in that too. Boards should be talking about what their strengths and weaknesses are as a whole. And speaking to that, is there a forum where board members can evaluate themselves? Board members, yes, should be evaluating themselves on a regular basis. And there's probably going to be, I mentioned it several times, boardsource.org. I know that there's some good resources there. I think there's great wealth in having a facilitator, a training, a workshop, engaging in some of that with your board of directors on a regular basis. Um, and to talk about a lot of the things that I shared with you today, but also to get really specific with them on what their strengths and weaknesses are individually, but also how they're functioning as a whole. There's great resources out there for that.